Let's get to the story of the day. I'd like to share two personal experiences with your listeners. Growing up, my family was not particularly religious, though we did attend church on occasion. When I was 4 years old, my mother asked my father what he wanted for Christmas that year, and he said he wanted a Bible. I had a hazy idea what that was, and I was relieved to see that he received one for Christmas. My father decided to read us the Christmas story from Matthew that night and gathered us all around him. I was the oldest of 3 siblings, the other 2 being younger brothers. He read the first chapter to us, and when he didn't get to the end of the story by the end of the chapter, he closed the book and said he would read it to us the next night. That started an almost 8-year tradition of reading us a chapter of the Bible every night before bed. We went all the way through the Bible 3 times in those years. We did not attend Bible studies, nor were we told how to interpret what we heard. I found myself alone in the sanctuary of our church one night several years after we had stopped doing this in our home. I was a senior in high school. My next oldest brother had died unexpectedly earlier in the year, and I found myself talking to God for the first time. I told him that listening to the Bible for all those years was similar to hearing someone read the phone book aloud. I asked him if he was real and told him I wanted to know if he was. There was no response. 3.5 years later, my senior year of college had just begun, and I was living with my grandmother. The young man I was madly in love with came through town and stayed with us for a couple of nights. He'd spent the summer working at a Christian conference center on the Oregon coast, where he'd made friends with a young man who lived near my grandmother. His friend had to leave the job before the end of the summer, but he wanted to hear the sermon given by a pastor who arrived after he had. My love, who was very fond of me but did not reciprocate my passion, taped the talk his friend had requested. The morning after my guy arrived at my grandmother's, he announced that he was going to his friend's house to play the cassette tape for him and asked if I wanted to accompany him. I certainly did. When he arrived at his friend's house, a cassette player was placed on the living room floor. A cassette was inserted, and we all started listening. I wasn't saying anything, but I was looking out the picture window to the south, watching the sun rise over a hill to the east of the house and enjoying the bright light streaming across the lawn. I became suddenly aware of a much greater light in the room behind my head. I turned around and looked. A tall column of light reached almost all the way to the ceiling in the doorway between the living room and dining room. I couldn't see a figure in it, but I knew it had to be Christ. He started walking toward me at the speed of a mortal man. I quickly looked around to see if anyone else could see the light. Nobody else appeared to notice it. When he arrived in my chair, he asked me telepathically, "Well?" I could hear him asking if I was going to walk with him or not. I enthusiastically agreed, and he promptly left. That encounter's joy lingered with me for days, weeks, and even now in a more subdued form. Within days, I realized that every cell in my body had changed as a result of the encounter. The brightness caused me to look away from the earthly sunlight, and when he spoke to me, I was unaware of the recording playing in the room. I was also aware that he was telling the truth, and that what he said was it, that I would not be able to persuade him otherwise, but I didn't have to. Almost 2.5 years later, I was attending graduate school and living in an old dormitory reserved for graduate students. While the dorm was co-ed, the men had 2 floors and the women had 1. The middle floor classroom was now the TV lounge, but because it was on one of the men's floors, the women rarely went in. I, on the other hand, had no problem going into the lounge to watch whatever I wanted and quickly made friends with many of the men, despite the fact that I'd never dated any of them. They took me in as a sister, and at least one of those friendships still exists today. While I had a degree in literature, I was also studying education in order to become a teacher. But like now, my interests were diverse and I enjoyed reading in a variety of genres. I started reading George Gamow's book, 1, 2, 3, Infinity, in December, near the end of the semester. By chapter 3, I was ecstatic because I suddenly realized, in a flash, how easily a theory of infinity could mathematically prove God's existence. I went to the TV lounge at noon one day, another sunny day, within a day or two of realizing this. I didn't see any of my close friends in the room, but there were about a dozen young men. I was standing next to a blackboard when I noticed chalk in the tray underneath it. At the time, a young man named Christian, who had recently completed his master's degree in mathematics, and I began talking about God. I didn't know him and was surprised at how quickly we got onto this topic. He claimed to be an atheist. I asked him what he would think if I could mathematically prove God's existence to him. You can imagine how skeptical he was, but he let me try. I took up the chalk and began sketching out my concept on the blackboard. I found myself across the room, with my back to the far wall, watching myself while I was talking and writing on the board. I was aware of an entity to my right, but there was no communication between us. I was taken aback when I noticed that half of the young men in the room were forming a line behind me and the other half were standing behind Christian. I got the impression they were picking sides. I noticed that I was still talking and writing, despite the fact that I was clearly across the room from my body. I think I panicked at that point, and then I was back in my body. When I was done speaking, I looked at Christian, who was now staring at me. He finally stammered that he would have to admit that he was no longer an atheist, but that he needed to think about it and would claim agnosticism for the time being. That was sufficient for me, and I staggered out of the room. Within a few hours, I had completely forgotten what I had told him and felt compelled to forget what I had learned about infinity and the proof of God. I was able to predict when people would die during this last experience, beginning with JFK's assassination and continuing with the death of my brother at the start of my senior year of high school. This talent made me uncomfortable. When I returned to the graduate dorm after Christmas break, I passed the TV lounge on my way up to my room, and the air was thick with death. This was like fog, a scent, or a combination of the two that I can't put into words. I soon discovered that two different young men who lived on that floor had died in separate car accidents while driving to their respective homes for the holidays. Christian was one of them. Soon after, I begged God to take away my ability to sense when death was in the air, as it simply upset me. He did, and I haven't had any problems with it since. On the other hand, being dead does not frighten me at all. When I talked to the light, Christ, in the first experience, I was watching myself from across the room while I talked about infinity.